I am Mandana Mosanzadagan. I am the Director of Member Engagement at the Scholar Strategy Network. Wonderful to have you all here with us today. I see a lot of familiar names, but I also know we have scholars outside of the network joining us here today. So I just want to very briefly give some information about our nonprofit nationwide organization. The Scholar Strategy Network helps researchers like yourselves connect with policymakers, civic leaders, and journalists, promoting the use of research evidence to improve policy and strengthen democracy. We have over 2,000 university-based researchers in our network currently across 36 chapters. And if you would like to learn more about us and how to join the network to receive public engagement support, in just a minute, I'm going to be sharing a link to our info sessions. We have a list of upcoming info sessions if you'd like to register for one. I'm also going to share a link to our website if you just want to go through our website to learn about us more that way. So that is just a little bit about the network. And now let's go ahead and get to our programming. We are joined by some of the authors of the new book, Enacting Change, a handbook for teaching advocacy and civic engagement. We're joined by our Maine SSN chapter leader, Rob Glover, alongside some of his co-authors, Kathleen Cole, Richard Meagher, and Melissa Stimell. Their co-author, Katharine Owens, couldn't join us today, unfortunately, but they're here to talk about how researchers like yourselves can bring civic engagement into the classroom for students. Before I hand it off to them, I do just want to let you all know we are recording this session. We're going to stop the recording when we get to Q&A. So just wanted to let everybody know. And without further ado, I'm going to let our wonderful panelists take it from here. Rob, Kathleen, Rich, feel free to start off by briefly introducing yourselves.
So I think I am first to go. So I'm Melissa Stimell, and I teach at Brandeis University within the Legal Studies program. And I also direct ENACT, which we'll be focusing on today. But I am so happy to be here with all of you to be spreading the word about ENACT and Enacting Change, the new book. So thank you so much for letting us be here and to talk to you. So, just to give you some backstory, and I'm going to try to not talk so fast because that's my modus operandi. So, please reach out and tell me if I am. Um, so, it was 2009, and I was confronted with students who were really passionate, but were feeling like they didn't have the skills to be change makers, and they wanted those skills. So I started talking to Massachusetts legislators, community organizations, teachers, and lobbyists about how to better engage students in our democracy. And the result was a course called Advocacy for Policy Change, a course that focused on teaching students about our democracy through engaging them deeply in the state legislative process. And at the state legislative process, students can have real access. They can meet with legislators. They're treated like people. They can sit down and have real conversations. So that was our focus. And through a multi-year grant, we were able to export this model across the country to all different kinds of universities and colleges, where these universities and colleges could adapt the model to their institution's needs, their students' population, and their legislative environment. And this network of schools, faculty, legislators, students, and community organizations supported by a digital network became ENACT, the Abraham Feinberg Educational Network for Active Civic Transformation. And ENACT has become a national, intercollegiate, nonpartisan organization that teaches students about our democracy through engaging them in the state legislative process. Because as we know, states can be the laboratories of democracy. This is a motto of Brandeis by Justice Brandeis. So, what did students do in ENACT courses? Well, they choose a bill before the legislature, and it's typically an issue that they feel passionate about, and they develop an expertise on the issue through research, through interviewing experts, through interviewing those affected by the problem, and they develop a legislative advocacy campaign. And they try to get the bill passed. And as in the real world, the students might create an elevator pitch, which is what would you say to a legislator to get your point across quickly if you met this person on the first floor and you were on the elevator with them to the fourth floor? How, how do you communicate about a bill quickly to get its essence across? They might write an op-ed. They may create an info commercial, and they talk to legislators. So the classroom becomes a laboratory within which students practice their communication skills, practice their advocacy skills before taking them out on the road to the state houses. And what we found is this course really empowers students to build their confidence, to feel like they have a voice in policymaking. And as my colleague Rob said, it helps them find spaces where their voices matter and where their voice can move the needle, even a little bit, on issues of importance to them. And we've done multiple program assessments about is ENACT doing what we think it's doing? And we found that it's really helping create an informed and more engaged citizenry with enactors voting at a higher rate than their counterparts, participating in our democracy at higher rates through donating to issues that are important to them, through signing petitions, through contacting elected officials. And 70%, over 70% say that the course shaped their professional trajectory, informing them and steering them towards public service and organizations dedicated to social justice. So I'll leave it there with the intro and let Rob take it away to get deeper into the structure of ENACT and its coursework. Thanks so much.
Great. Thanks, Melissa. So hi, everybody. I'm Rob Glover. I am, as Mandana mentioned, I am one of the co-leaders of the Maine chapter of SSN, which I've been doing since 2017. I also teach at the University of Maine. I'm a professor of political science. And I've been here since 2011. And the group that's talking to you today kind of got in on the ground floor of ENACT in, I think, 2016. So shortly before I came on as co-leader for Maine SSN, I had started working with ENACT. I'll just give kind of the roadmap of what we'll discuss today. So this is, we are presenting this in conjunction with a book that we've published. It's meant to be a very practical handbook for faculty who are interested in doing this type of work and integrating this into their pedagogy. And those of you that are involved with SSN, many of the things that we're going to talk about in kind of a pedagogical sense are also things that we talk about just in relation to doing public-facing work and trying to influence public policy as researchers and academics. So you'll see a lot of overlap there. And we'll just be presenting kind of vignettes or insights from our respective contributions to the book. So we're going to start with talking about visiting the Capitol with students and things to keep in mind as we do that. Rich Marr is going to talk about legislative research and guiding students through conducting legislative research. And I'll round out our discussion with talking about building relationships, and some of the ways in which we can work to build relationships, not only with lawmakers, but with those who have connections to the state legislature and can act as mentors and guides for our students. So just as kind of a reminder to kind of set the stage for what we'll talk about, as Melissa laid out quite well, an ENACT course is one that involves direct policy advocacy at the state level on behalf of the students. So the core of ENACT is really helping students enter policy spaces as informed, respectful, and strategic advocates. And it's also designed to demystify the legislative process and show students that they don't need a law degree, they don't need to be a lobbyist to have an impact in this space. They identify a real bill, so we align these sessions typically with an active legislative session, and they're doing research in real time as the bill is making its way through the legislative process. And they're advocating oftentimes for that bill. In some cases, my students are advocating against the bill, right? They're trying to prevent the bill from passing. And that way students learn both the technical skills associated with this, but also the dispositional ones like confidence or persistence or clear communication. And they produce some real deliverables, as Melissa mentioned, op-eds, testimony, fact sheets, outreach plans. What would a coalition on this bill look like and how would you build it? And they get to see the real world outcomes. Some of them actually provide testimony before committees, shape amendments, build coalitions. So that's the core of kind of what an ENACT course entails. There's some different features to the ENACT course, and we lay this out in the book. But one is that these are obviously experiential courses, right? So ENACT is very much grounded in learning by doing. Students aren't simulating engagement. They aren't writing as if you were presenting testimony. Many of them are like prepping testimony to deliver or prepping for meetings that they're going to have with lawmakers or sponsors of bills. It is focused on the state level. So we deliberately work in the policy area where students are in greater proximity to lawmakers and the decisions being made. And we talk in very concrete ways about how if they want to impact politics, the starting point oftentimes should be in their communities directly. Where are the decision points and the places where power resides, where you can have the most immediate impact? And that might not be Washington, D.C. It might be your state capital. It might even be, your local city council. It is evidence-based. So the courses build on decades of scholarship on experiential learning, advocacy, civic engagement, and it also enforces in students that when they go to the State House, not only should they be telling their story and situating their legitimacy to talk about an issue, but they should come armed with the facts and evidence, and very much try and ground what they say in evidence. It is modular, meaning that some of us teach ENACT our courses with all of the different dimensions that Melissa mentioned, and some of us just want to integrate kind of a piece of this and maybe build out over time something that is an entire course structured around state legislative advocacy. But we might start with just a few assignments that are an interesting application of ideas that you're learning in a more abstract sense. And then lastly, it is interdisciplinary. So the warm home for these sorts of courses is obviously political science, governments, public policy, but we've had folks teach these courses in public health, environmental studies, nursing. There's a variety of different ways in which you can think about this. It's not linked to any one discipline or any area. And I lied, that's not the last thing. It is also fun and exciting. So these courses, students, after an initial period in which they're kind of freaked out and they don't feel like they can rise to the challenge, ultimately they find the immediacy and the urgency of what they're doing in these courses very, very cool and very fun. And there's something really, really exciting on their part and also exciting on our part when we move from a space in which you're anxious and you're kind of overwhelmed to really feeling empowered and confident and gaining a sense of political efficacy. So that's just the basic ENACT model. And then we're going to talk about different dimensions of what teaching this course entails. And we're going to start with my colleague Kathleen Cole at Metro State, who's going to talk about actually visiting the Capitol with students. So I'll turn it over to Kathleen.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Rob. Yeah, my name is Kathleen Cole. I am a professor of political science at Metropolitan State University. And I'm also an organizer here in Minneapolis, organizing in the areas of racial and economic justice. And I just want to say thank you to Melissa for sharing this model with us, and also enabling us to become like collaborators and developers of what ENACT has become. Because ENACT has completely changed how I teach. In fact, it spurned a whole new major in my department. So, this has been not only transformational for my students, but it's been transformational for me as a faculty member. And so I just want to say thanks to Melissa. Um, can we go to the next slide, please? Thanks. So what I'm going to talk about today is how we prepare students for Capitol visits. Um, it's one thing when we're in a classroom and we can kind of control, we have a lot more control over what happens, and we can be really intentional about how we want to structure conversations or activities. But when we take them out into the real world and outside of the constraints of a classroom, we have a lot less control. And it's also a really intimidating place for students. They are entering an environment that's really fancy. The buildings are fancy. Everybody's wearing professional clothes. It can feel like a really intimidating place. And so what I try to do with my students to prepare them for their Capitol visits is really acknowledge those identity threats that can happen at the Capitol and work to create a supportive class community that can help us to collectively share the weight of being in this exciting but intimidating place, and to support each other in taking risks when we feel under threat. So, Rob, if you don't mind going to the next page. So when I'm talking about identity risks, really what I've seen in my students, and I think Rob gestured to this just a moment ago, is that I teach at a school that my students are, we have a majority BIPOC campus. It's majority women. It's like 75% first generation college students, lots of immigrants and refugees. And it's primarily low income people. And so our students are not well represented at the Capitol, and they're unlikely to feel super welcome there. And so what I really focus on in my class is preparing them to be willing to like walk into these spaces and take risks, and make demands on legislators that they don't expect to be responsive for them. One of the things that I think is really true about working with students, or really just like human beings of any kind, is that when we can learn best when we feel supported in community. And so what I try to do is think about and identify and talk explicitly about with my students the kinds of risks we might feel due to marginalized identities, or thinking that we don't have the expertise or knowledge that's necessary to be at the Capitol, or not seeing our groups represented at the Capitol, and really collectively normalize that it's going to feel a little scary potentially, but to develop a strong sense of community, and that we are in solidarity with one another, so that when we're going to the Capitol, we can support each other and celebrate our successes, and be there to vent when things do not go our way. And so community is really built into the class in a few different ways. We do a lot of check-ins, both individual and team check-ins, but also in having the students work in teams. By having them advocate in teams rather than individuals working on bills, that really does automatically build in a little bit of a support network for them as they're doing their work together. Some other things that I do with students to help them manage their feelings of risk is, capitals can be really difficult places to navigate. In Minnesota, our Capitol campus is connected all by underground tunnels because it's so cold and there's so much snow for so much of the year here. And it's really easy to get lost in those tunnels. And so that can create its own kind of anxiety. And my whole goal with my students is to do as much as I can to lower their anxiety so they can really spend all of their cognitive processing energy on the task of advocating while they're there. And so we definitely make as many trips to the Capitol as we can before we have our advocacy meetings. So at the beginning of the semester, we're there, doing tours, different tours of the building. We're checking out different resources. We're having different meetings there before they end up having those group meetings with their legislators. I also work to arrange class visits with legislators who share my students' identities. And so I'll invite a panel of legislators to come to my class, legislators that are working class people who've been elected, who are BIPOC members of our legislature, who share the backgrounds of my students to talk about what it means to them to be in that space. Where, they maybe weren't the most obvious or expected people to be there. And then the last thing that I want to share with y'all is an activity that I do called the narrative tour of the Capitol. So we go into the Minnesota State Capitol and we read the building, meaning, all the art, the architecture, everything that's there. And we're thinking about who's represented here. If this building tells the story of Minnesota, what's the story that it tells? And we really think about, who's like assumed to be the audience of the building. And then what does it mean for us to be the folks who are actually showing up there to do this work? And how are we going to support each other through it? And so, giving students that opportunity to really acknowledge openly and reflect on together and develop strategies together for what it means to do this work in a place that um, depending on what state you're in, might be actively hostile to the things that your students want to work on. Um, you know, Giving them that space to develop those relationships and to come up with strategies for how they're going to manage that is a really big part of how I teach the course and what we talked about in our chapter on preparing students for Capitol visits. So I think that's all I got, Rob.
Great. Thanks so much, Kathleen. So now I'm going to turn it over to Rich Marr, who, is going to talk a little bit about the process of guiding students through legislative research. Rich.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Again, I'm Rich Marr. I teach political science at Randolph-Macon College, just north of Richmond, Virginia. And I want to echo Kathleen's wonderful description of how transformative ENACT has been for me. Certainly, the nature of this course and the work we do has infected a lot of the other coursework as well as scholarship that I've done. And I do want to thank Melissa and also David Weinstein, who's the assistant director of ENACT, is on this call, and the two of them have been wonderful in guiding us. I don't know if you noticed, but while Melissa was talking, there was an image of our initial cohort of faculty fellows at the Massachusetts State House. And what's amazing is I haven't changed at all. I look exactly the same as I did 10 years ago. All right, on that note, I will move on and I want to talk to you about legislative research, really just about what the students need to know before they get involved in this work, right? And certainly, I think the biggest question that I think that first people ask when they encounter this model, and I know that I asked and a number of us fellows asked when we encountered it, was what bills should students choose? How do students decide? How do we as faculty help them, guide them in deciding what bills are appropriate for this class and what aren't? And in the book, we provide this matrix. Your mileage may vary on how helpful it is, but it does lay out some of the considerations that both instructors and students should think about when they think about the bills that they're going to select. And the matrix is aligned on two axes, from internal to external factors and from sort of interest in an issue versus perception of an issue. I think the internal and external is fairly easy to parse out. It's, the sort of internal factors are about the person, the student themselves, and what bills are a good match for them. Partially, you certainly want students to engage in work that they care about. And so trying to match their passions and interests to the legislation that's pending. And it depends on the State House and the culture and the issues of the day. But I usually try to steer students towards bills that they have an interest in, We often encourage students to think about K-12 education. If they're of traditional age, that's often something they have experience with and familiarity with. Others have their own sort of pet issues. They might be heavily interested in environmental issues or passionate about mental health. And so we certainly can come up with exercises for them to chase that. But it also they need to consider not just their interest, but how they are sort of what they represent in the world. I know Melissa often tells this story about early in her ENACT teaching, having a couple of young men in her class who were really interested in reproductive rights and really wanted to pursue that issue. And Melissa didn't tell them no, but really tried to get them to think, are you two 19-year-old men the best avatars for this issue of reproductive rights? Are you going to be the best? Do you represent the identity that will be perceived and accepted well at the state legislature as ones who can speak for a bill? And certainly we don't want to be prescriptive, but we want to create an environment where we're thoughtful, both educators and students, about what bills will work and what bills you can best advocate for. And I think that's probably a broader lesson about advocacy, to think about connecting passion and identity to the things you want to advocate for. On the external side of things outside of the students are the sort of broader political environment. And certainly ENACT is a nonpartisan program, and we encourage, certainly wouldn't prescript anyone, a particular kind of bill or partisan, affiliation is appropriate. But students have partisan affiliations and ideological predilection, interests, and there's a broader political environment that we must engage in, and we have to be aware of what are the current issues that are being discussed in our state legislatures, and some of those have a lot of heat on them. Some of those students might be ill-advised, sticking their nose into, and others they might be very helpful. And so just getting a sense of the environment, the political environment, and what issues are controversial, what issues are feasible for change. We certainly do not evaluate students in a class based on the success in advocacy. Your bill failed, and therefore so do you. It's not what we recommend in the ENACT approach. But you do have to think about the question of, sort of long-term versus short-term change. And again, students have to think about, is this a bill that has a chance at all of being considered? Is it a bill that's going to be killed next week in a committee? Or is this something that we can work on for the entire semester? Is this something that even if it does get killed, we're so passionate and convinced about that we want to carry it forward, or we want to work on the next session, or we know that even if it's not active now, we have a plan of what we're going to do to continue our work here during this semester. So these are some of the considerations we encourage our educators and students to think about when they think about choosing a bill, and that feeds into and requires a lot of fact finding. You have to understand the political environment. You have to understand some things. And so we have offered some models for assignments that help students do that. And I wanted to mention two of them, the first being a legislative research report. And for folks who are, let's say, maybe not as familiar with experiential learning or a little concerned about, particularly educators and engaging with the model, I think the legislative research report is often a good foothold, because it's very academic. It's very, it can be very much like work you've done in other courses, both you and students, right? It can be the group project. It can be the group presentation, the group, research report. That can be very much like a policy report or a research report in any other class. And so students and faculty often find that a very good kind of assignment to base things around. But we also encourage you to include things in it, not just, data on the scope of the problem that the bill is looking to address, and maybe some alternative policy choices that have either been made in the state or in other states, options that may have been considered or that may reflect some input on the current bill that's pending in front of the legislature. But we also encourage students and faculty to think about conducting a stakeholder analysis, right? To try to dig into who are the players involved in this policy issue here in our state, and what sides do they line up on, and what does that mean for feasibility and the arguments that have been made. So there's a lot of ways to look at doing legislative research to enable students to just feel like they can speak with authority, right? And you want to encourage students to recognize they're not going to become experts as as much as someone who's been in the field for 20 years, but they can learn enough and get enough information that they can feel confident in their meetings with legislators and their offerings of testimony, and to build this sort of skills that we certainly encourage students to develop in all of our academic work about use of argument, use of evidence, citing sources, critical thinking, and things like that. We also encourage students to do an assignment that I call here a one-pager. Different members of the network have different names for this assignment. And if you've ever engaged in advocacy work, you know that this is sort of the currency of advocacy. Advocates all across the country emphasize the idea of a single piece of paper that is a piece of paper, of course, can be used digitally as well, that you hand to a legislator or legislative staffer that becomes the kind of encapsulation of all that research that you've done, and that you leave behind with the legislator so that they know who you were, they have a record of the meeting, they remember what you argued for, and they have a very clear idea of what you're asking them to do. Vote for this bill, vote against this bill, gives information about the bill, arguments about the bill. It can also include personal stories, either from the students, from advocacy networks, from news and media accounts, so that it helps to, politics is all about storytelling, so narratives that help explain what's at stake and why the bill's solution is important, and a fact sheet that has a number of facts. And this is actually, I think, an important skill for students to learn who are engaging in politics. Some of my students are political science majors, some are not, but those who are going to go on to careers in politics, just understanding these basic mechanics of advocacy in legislatures, that this is something that professional advocates will often provide when they do their research, when they do their work in advocacy meetings. So you're bringing the same thing to the table that advocacy networks and professional lobbyists are bringing to legislators, again, giving them that confidence to meet with them. So we have a number of other ideas and recommendations for assignments and things like that, but I'll leave it there and hand it back to you, Rob.
All right, thanks so much, Rich. So I'm going to close by talking about building relationships, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. But obviously, if you're going to do this work, I mean, it's the type of thing that really requires active collaboration with lawmakers and potentially other folks who are involved in the state legislature. It doesn't have to strictly be lawmakers. It could be advocacy organizations. It could be those who have business regularly before the legislature and kind of understand the mechanics of how it works. It can even be, the governmental relations person at your university. So how do we start to build those relationships whereby students can talk to people who are directly involved in the process and kind of get in the door, but get in the door with some mentors and some people that are going to provide kind of a good nurturing experience for them. And hopefully they don't get lost in the tunnels or, that sort of thing. And so, as I said at the outset, a lot of this, those of you that are involved with the Scholar Strategy Network, a lot of this is going to sound really, really similar to the sorts of advice that we give to scholars who are interested in doing public-facing work and translating some of their research expertise and insights into, very clear, very precise recommendations or insights that could be passed to lawmakers. So oftentimes, if you're in SSN, you've probably been in a training where at the very least you did like some sort of miniature version of something called power mapping. And really that's kind of similar to what you do for this sort of class. ENACT doesn't have to start with, cold calls to people in legislative leadership or sitting lawmakers. Oftentimes it starts with kind of an inventory of the networks you already have and the ways in which you could connect with lawmakers, former lawmakers, people who engage in advocacy, activist networks, things like that. So basically your state house is kind of closer than it appears. And I'll say too that, like, similar to what Rich said, your mileage may vary. So I am blessed to be doing this in the state of Maine, in which, like, there's a tremendous amount of transparency and an expectation of access to lawmakers that has not been the case in like other states that I've lived in, you know. And so like that for me is like it's a treasure. And that's one of the things that I want to teach to my students is that like you have this amazing system in which you can show up at the state house and lawmakers will sit down with you and listen to you. And that's not the case that you're going to experience in every state or in every setting. Um, in terms of thinking about those relationships, one thing that you could start to do is inventory your networks, map who you already know, either directly or indirectly. And even if you're not directly involved in politics, or oftentimes we encounter this when we have folks who are kind of new to the state, right? Like maybe a new faculty member who's moved to Maine, they might not yet be embedded in the networks or the advocacy organizations that are regularly going to be going to the state house. But even just thinking about like on campus, right? There are people who can help facilitate those connections. So alumni of your department, colleagues, local leaders, folks on campus who have business before the legislature, they can be your starting point and say, yes, you should absolutely talk to this person. They're in the legislature, they serve on this committee, they've worked with folks at the university before on this issue. So that can be your starting point. And oftentimes when we do that exercise with SSN members, we find that people who think that they're starting from, you know, point zero actually already have like 5 or 6 different potential connections. And the process of building relationships for ENACT is kind of similar. You're also, by virtue of being in the state, right, you are a constituent of someone, right? Like some lawmaker has to listen to you, or at least should listen to you, because they represent you. And many of us were in, you know, college towns in which like the college is an entity that like the lawmaker representing that district needs to pay attention to. So in those settings, state legislators can be accessible and they might be eager to engage. It might be a really neat opportunity for them to get their foot in the door and actually interact with some students at the university, which is within their district. I would also say don't underestimate university ties. So like, especially if you're at a state university, they're going to be really mindful of things like the budget appropriation from the legislature. And so they're probably going to have somebody who does legislative advocacy or a governmental relations person. They also, like in your alumni office, if there are alumni of your institution that are now sitting legislators or at some point in their career have served in the legislature, if your alumni office is doing its job, they should be knowledgeable about who those people are, because they want to celebrate them and they also want to try to use the leverage that they have and the political connections that they have for advocacy on policymaking or fundraising, whatever it might be. So like talking to people in your alumni office and just getting a sense of who are the different lawmakers or former lawmakers that graduated from the institution where you teach can be really useful. Former legislators are great. I've found when I invite sitting legislators in, one, they're really, really busy. And because we align this course with the legislative session, and we're about an hour and 15 minutes away from the state capitol, typically if we want to talk to lawmakers while the legislature is in session, we are going to them. And that's very cool, and that's a great experience. But sometimes it's nice to bring lawmakers into the classroom, and that's much, much harder to do while the legislature is in session. They just don't have the time to do that. But former lawmakers are great. And oftentimes they will give you kind of a more unvarnished take of what actually happens in the legislature. And they're not as cautious as folks who are, you know, trying to preserve relationships and not say anything that might be taken out of context would be, who are sitting legislators. And we're lucky here at the University of Maine to have like 4 or 5 former lawmakers who actually work at the university. They're either faculty or they work in staff in some capacity. And so they've been really, really great. Civic organizations, so advocacy groups, nonprofits, unions, coalitions around specific campaigns or issues. Those folks, they already have trusted relationships inside the building. They might be really, really interested in ways that they could involve students in their larger policy coalition around some bill. And so they might come in and kind of pitch you on your student should work on this bill that we have coming up about you know, criminal justice reform or something like that. But they can just be great in terms of like If you have a conversation with those folks and say, here are the issues that I'm hearing from my students that they're very interested in, they can flag bills for you. They might have more institutional memory actually than some of the sitting legislators. So here in the state of Maine, we have term limits. And so oftentimes the people that work in advocacy or in some staff roles, they have a longer duration in the legislature than some of the sitting lawmakers. Like somebody who's recently elected to their first term in the legislature might not know that the bill that your students are working on, there's been 7 different iterations of it, and it's always failed because of like some coalition that rises up against it. But people who work in advocacy and have been involved in these coalitions can flag those sorts of issues for you. And also people who are like nonpartisan staff who just do, they're like analysts or they staff committees or things like that, and they're not tied to one party or another. They might have that sort of institutional knowledge and that memory that they can bring to conversations. So I guess the point is to think broadly and diversely about the types of relationships that you want to build in order to run this class well and to ensure that your students get as rich and diverse a set of insights that they possibly can, that they're not just talking to lawmakers or lawmakers of a specific type or ideology, but that you're really exposing them to all the sorts of different people that interact with your state legislature. And that also it helps you. It helps you in the sense that like you have a pretty broad network that you can tap into, both to cater to the interests of your students, like what sorts of issues they're interested in, but also just inevitably as turnover happens, right? So like I've taught this course long enough now that we've been working really, really closely with legislators. Someone will term out and I'll be like, that's okay. I know this other person. They're actually on the same committee. We can work with them. So that's been really, really helpful. And the key thing is like, don't be overwhelmed by the idea of making connections with people in the legislature. It will be easier than you think it is, and you probably already have some of those connections. The other thing that I'll just throw in too, I just thought of this in the close too, is political journalists. I know like state house journalism, there's fewer and fewer journalists actually going to the state house and covering state politics. But if you want a really, really rich and informative session from somebody that knows where all the bodies are buried and like just gets like dorkily excited about talking shop about state politics, invite in a seasoned political journalist who covers the state house, and they'll be able to really, really give you kind of rich information to integrate into your class. So I think those are kind of the main ideas that we wanted to present. I think probably now we can transition to Q&A. I realized as I was talking, I was not moving my slides, but I swear everything that's on the slides, I also said, and we'll make the slides available as well. But we'd be really interested to hear what questions you all have about any dimension of the stuff that we've talked about, or just thinking about ways to involve students actively in legislative advocacy or just political engagement more generally.
Thank you so much, Rob. As I mentioned in the chat, you can put your questions in there in the chat, or you can use the raise your hand feature. But actually, I wanted to really quickly just pose a question before I leave it to the rest of the audience to ask questions. I wanted to pose a question for David, David Weinstein, who Rob introduced, is the Assistant Director of ENACT. David, I was wondering if you could just very briefly share a little bit about the network aspects of ENACT, your specifically the online platform, the student delegate program, if you could share a little bit about that.
Sure, thanks. Yes, I'm David Weinstein, Assistant Director of ENACT, also based at Brandeis, and a member of the Boston chapter of SSN. So an important component of ENACT is our national network. We provide students and the public searchable access to resources created by ENACT students in these courses on our enactnetwork.org website. The deliverables that Rob Glover referenced, legislative reports, videos for social media, elevator speeches, op-eds, and more, as well as access to resources by and for our ENACT faculty fellows that support the development and teaching of ENACT courses, some of which I think really helped kind of inspire this book to make that more accessible. And we foster interpersonal connections throughout this network. So every year Several alumni of ENACT courses from around the country serve as ENACT student delegates. They offer advice to current students. They share resources during virtual visits to the classes taking place around the country each semester. And they host network-wide events like ENACT alumni networking nights, discussions with state legislators. And throughout the academic year, we convene ENACT faculty fellows to discuss topics related to teaching these courses, sometimes responding in the moment to questions that are arising in the course of teaching or developing a course, other times, kind of stepping back and digging deep into some aspect of the program. So I just wanted to make sure that we lift that up as a key aspect now that ENACT has been or is really in every state around the country. And I like to reinforce that for students, wherever they're from, wherever they're going, there's somebody who is part of our ENACT network.